Today, my first guest is author Tanya Egan Gibson, who will be appearing at the Rancho Mirage Library on Monday, January 11th at 7 p.m. to discuss her new debut novel from Dutton Publishers, How to Buy a Love of Reading. Now, Tanya was on my show this past fall when her book was released, and I sure look forward to her appearance here, and I want to encourage all of you to get out and welcome her. Tanya, hi, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me back.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here, and I want to tell our audience a little bit about you before we get into the questions. Tanya was born and raised on Long Island, the scene of her book. She has a BA in English from Cornell University and an MA from the University of Washington. She's a former high school English teacher and began her novel while teaching. She and her family reside in Northern California. Tanya, let's begin with a brief overview of the story, How to Buy a Love of Reading.
Well, the novel is about a wealthy family who live on the North Shore of Long Island, who are dismayed to find out that their 16-year-old daughter has announced at her private school that she's never read a book that she liked. And so, because it's also a Sweet 16 season there, and everybody is having these gala Sweet 16s, they decide to give her a huge Sweet 16 present, which is to commission an author to write a book just for her, so that they can buy her the love of reading.
And as I mentioned, the book does take place on Long Island, and you managed to parlay your love of the Great Gatsby into your book. Now, how did you go about doing that? When you started this book, did you say, well, I'm going to talk about Gatsby? How did that all come together, and how do you present it in your book?
That's a really good question. I really love The Great Gatsby. I did not always love The Great Gatsby. And so I have one character in there, her best friend Hunter, who loves to read, who is obsessed with Fitzgerald, and who kind of sees everything through the lens of Fitzgerald and Gatsby. And so I thought that, I've also met students when I was a teacher who really disliked Gatsby. And so I have different characters looking at that book differently. There's an author, the author who's commissioned to write this book for Carly actually really doesn't get Gatsby at all. And it's meanwhile taking place on the Long Island Sound, which is, of course, a very large symbol in Gatsby, with place where Gatsby looks out and sees the green light on Daisy's dock.
So, did you make the conscious decision that you were going to have this run through of Gatsby throughout the novel, or did that kind of happen as you went along?
It did happen more or less organically. At the beginning, I knew I wanted a character who would be kind of obsessed with Gatsby and with Fitzgerald, and since it was being set on the Gold Coast, that made some sense to me. But Gatsby ended up working its way into my book more and more the more I rewrote it. So I think for me, it was pretty organic.
Well, and it was a beautiful connection also, the way you did create that. I just want to tell my audience that this is the Jacqueline Bachar Show, and I'm talking to Tanya Egan Gibson, who will be at the Rancho Mirage Library on Monday, January 11th at 7 p.m. to discuss her new debut novel from Dutton Publishers, How to Buy a Love of Reading. Tanya, there is so much depth to the novel. There's stories within stories, books within the book, television shows, and even advice on how to write a story. At the same time, each section of the book is titled with a descriptive literary term. Now, this is a book as much for a writer as for the reader, and I did ask you about this in our interview back in the fall, and I'd like you to talk about that a little more, how you did that, and do you see this book also as much for a writer as for a reader?
I do in certain ways. When I ended up structuring it so that each part talked about a different literary term, like plot, there's a part that's on plot, there's a part that's on setting, I was being very conscious about the fact that that's a very writerly thing to do and that appeals to writers. But one of the themes of the book is that to take apart things and think about them too much, like in those very literary ways, sometimes takes away from a story. Sometimes a story is best consumed just as a story. And so I wanted to do something writerly there, but I also wanted to undercut the writerliness and say, maybe we don't need to know all of these terms. Maybe we don't have to be so literary about everything that we read. Sometimes it's just best to read a story with your heart.
But I do think that that's part of what makes this book so interesting, and makes people that do write want to read it, because the word goes around about what the book is about. And naturally, any successful book, any writer wants to take a look at and say, okay, how did she do that? I want to do it too. So I think that sometimes, even though one might do something unconsciously, you really have created something here that is as much for the writer.
I'm glad.
Good.
Well, I like to, one of the neatest things about having a book published in the world is that I get to go out and talk to a lot of writers and a lot of, people who really want to be published and are trying to figure out, how to structure a novel and all that. And so if this is of any help, whether it's subversive help or not, I think that's great.
Well, that's right. And I'm sure you're going to get a lot of writers coming to see and hear you at the Rancho Mirage Library, because that's where the local chapter of the Palm Springs Writers Guild meets. So I think you'll be getting a lot of questions like this.
I love talking about writing.
Good. Now, tell us what the inspiration was for your novel.
Well, when I was a high school English teacher on the North Shore of Long Island, my very first year, I had this terrific department head who let me structure my own course and make up my own syllabus, of which I was, probably way too proud in my late 20s. And I had one student, alas, who every single thing I put on the syllabus she said was boring and that she hated. And I just finally said to her, well, what can I do to put something on here that you might like? Because I couldn't imagine hating, never having, read anything you liked. And she said, nothing. I hate books. I've never read a book I liked. And I was a little bit floored by that. And at the time, because I was young, I just assumed that there must be an easy reason for that, like TV. I accused her of watching too much television, which is odd since it's one of my own vices. But in any case, she said that no, it wasn't television that consumed her. It was actually replaying real things that happened in her day, that rather than reading fiction, she liked to make fiction out of the real things that happened with her and her friends during the day in her head. She liked to daydream it. And I thought that was such a cool thing. I couldn't fault her that. You can fault people watching too much Survivor on TV, but you can't fault them for being too introspective. That's just wrong.
Well, absolutely.
So it became part of the character trait for my main character, for Carly, who replays her life that way through things she calls after memory, where she changes things to make them what she wished had happened.
Well, did you try to encourage her to write all of this down? Did you get into that kind of discussion with her?
I wish I could say I did,
oh.
but I did not. I think at age 20-something, I just kind of tucked my tail and decided, okay, well, she's a very nice girl, but she just does not like to read. But that doesn't mean that she did not like story, and that is part of the backbone of my book, is that I think reading is really important, but I think story, in whatever form, is even more important. It's something that makes us human. And what this girl was telling me was that she might not like reading, but story, it was something that she cared about.
Yes, and I think we all know that the number of people, younger people in particular, that read books per se has diminished, but they do read what they see on the internet, and there's a lot of work being published, if you want to use that term, on the internet. Much of it is kind of short and sweet and to the point. Do you anticipate doing something like that, getting at least a portion of your book on the internet, or are you going into a Kindle production of the novel?
My novel is available as an ebook, and so it can be purchased for Kindle or for other ebook devices, and there's an excerpt of it online at my website. There's a lot of kind of interactive, different things on my website, actually, including some pretend books on virtual bookshelves that have snippets of the pretend books that I mention in my book.
Yes,
so
I've been on your website, and at first, when I first went onto it, I thought, hearing these footsteps and then the light coming on, I thought, well, now this is interesting. What is it? So why don't you tell my audience what your website address is, because I do want to encourage them, as I'm sure you do, to go onto your website.
It is www.howtobuyaloveofreading.com, and there are a bunch of interactive features. There is also a book trailer, which I think is kind of fun on it, that my husband and I made. And there's a place where you can submit a story about how reading changed or even saved your life, so that you can share that with other people.
Oh,
and
I think that's great. I haven't seen that yet. Then
it's the part that says submit your story, and you can go and read a lot of other people's stories about how reading changed them. And this is one of my favorite parts of the website, because I get to read the stories and post them, and feel a bond with people I've never met over how stories really, as I said, make us human.
What kind of numbers are you getting to that request? Or how many people would you say have responded so far?
I think maybe, between 20 and 30. Not as many as I would like, to be quite honest.
But no, that's good.
I think that people sometimes feel shy, and I've gotten emails from people saying, I want to write my story, but it's not maybe exciting enough. I don't think that's something people should worry about, because I think, when you're being honest online about something like that, it usually touches people. It doesn't have to be exciting. It doesn't have to be like, well, a book stopped a bullet. That was because I was holding it over my heart.
Yeah, right. Well, again, I want to say I'm talking to Tanya Egan Gibson about her first published book, How to Buy a Love of Reading, and she is going to be at the Rancho Mirage Library on Monday, January 11th at 7 p.m. And you're going to be talking about and signing your books there. Is that not right? People will be able to buy the book?
I am. I'm going to be doing a little reading from the book and then discussing pretty much anything people want me to discuss about the book, and I'll be signing.
That's great. So you're going to have a Q&A then.
I am.
Afterwards. Do you have any particular focus at this appearance at the library, besides talking about your book, which is the main thing, of course, that we all want you to do and hope that you're going to be doing? But will you be bringing up some of these same things that you've just been talking about? Will you be discussing your website and how people can submit these articles about how reading changed them?
Absolutely. And as I said, I'm happy to discuss any aspect of writing. This was a long journey for me. I started writing this book 10 years ago, so it's not one of these stories of, hey, I had an idea and then 2 seconds later I had an agent and a deal or something. This for me was a very, very long journey, and I do like to talk to other writers about kind of how I got there and why it's worth hanging in to do it, and why you want to love writing while you're doing it.
Absolutely. Well, very quickly, what is the main point that you want readers to take away from your book? If there's any main point, but what is it? What is the one thing that you want people to feel or think about after they've read your book?
That books aren't just about pretty words. Books are about people. They're the point for me of why I love reading is because I love people. It's because I love love. I love emotion. This isn't just about books for me, and the heart of this book isn't about being clever. It's really about being a person and connecting.
Well, thank you, Tanya. We are out of time. Thanks so much for being with us.